You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Marcus Aurelius.
There is a moment in almost every person's life when something subtle but powerful happens, and most people never even notice it. It might occur in childhood, perhaps during a quiet afternoon at school. A teacher praises one student in front of the class, while another remains unnoticed. The room fills with small glances, silent comparisons, invisible judgments forming in the minds of children who are still learning how the world works. Or maybe it happens later, in an office. A manager passes by two employees working side by side. One receives a compliment, the other receives silence. Nothing dramatic is said, nothing openly cruel happens. And yet something important begins to take root in the mind. Because from that moment forward, a quiet question begins to echo beneath many human decisions. Do they approve of me? Most people never realize how deeply this question shapes their lives. They adjust their words, they soften their opinions. They hide parts of themselves that might disturb others, not because they are weak, but because somewhere along the way, they were taught that emotional acceptance is survival. And so they learn to feel everything deeply. Praise becomes nourishment, criticism becomes pain, rejection becomes something close to a wound. But here is a question almost nobody stops to ask. What if this sensitivity is precisely what makes people easy to control? Consider how often people carry emotional injuries for years because of a single moment. An insult spoken casually, a betrayal that still echoes in memory, a relationship that ended without explanation. Why do these moments linger so powerfully? Why can a sentence spoken in 10 seconds influence someone's emotional state for 10 years? The answer reveals something unsettling about human psychology. Many people unknowingly give the outside world direct access to their inner stability. Every opinion, every gesture, every sign of approval or rejection from others becomes a lever that can move their emotional state. And once someone else can move your emotions, they can begin to influence your behavior. Not always deliberately. But influence rarely needs conscious intention to be effective. Think about a small scene that happens every day in workplaces around the world. An employee stays late to finish tasks long after everyone else has gone home. Another colleague approaches and places a stack of additional work on the desk. "You're always so reliable," the colleague says with a friendly smile. The words sound like praise. But hidden beneath that compliment is a quiet transaction. The employee hesitates for a moment, feeling tired, wanting to leave. And yet something inside pushes them to accept. Not because the task is fair, not because the workload is reasonable, but because declining the request risks losing the approval hidden inside that sentence. How many decisions in life are quietly shaped by that invisible pressure? How often do people say yes when they want to say no? How often do they tolerate disrespect simply because they fear appearing difficult? How often do they remain silent when something inside them knows they should speak? Most people believe they are making rational choices, but often they are simply protecting emotional comfort. Centuries ago, a Florentine thinker observed this pattern in human behavior with almost surgical clarity. Niccolò Machiavelli spent much of his life studying power, not through abstract theory, but through careful observation of how people actually behave when influence, ambition, and survival are involved. He watched rulers rise and fall. He watched alliances form and dissolve. He watched friends betray each other the moment interests shifted. And through those observations, he reached a conclusion that many people find uncomfortable even today. Human beings rarely act purely out of loyalty or affection. Most actions are guided by advantage. This does not mean people are evil. It means people are predictable. The person who benefits from you will likely treat you well. A person who no longer benefits from you may behave very differently. Once you see this pattern clearly, many confusing moments from life begin to make sense. Think back to a time when someone suddenly became distant. Perhaps a friend who once called frequently stopped reaching out. A colleague who once praised your ideas began dismissing them. A partner who once seemed devoted slowly withdrew their attention. At first, these changes feel personal. People often assume they did something wrong. They search their memory for mistakes. They replay conversations. They analyze every small detail. But what if the real explanation is simpler? What if the shift was never about emotion at all? What if it was about utility? This possibility may sound cynical at first, yet observing life carefully often reveals how frequently relationships are shaped by changing interests. A conversation at a networking event illustrates this perfectly. Two strangers meet in a crowded room. Their dialogue flows easily as long as they believe the other person might offer a professional opportunity. Both smile, both listen attentively, both show enthusiasm. But the moment one realizes the other holds no useful connection, the energy subtly changes. The conversation shortens, excuses appear, attention moves elsewhere. Nothing hostile happens, but the warmth disappears almost instantly. Why does this happen so naturally? Because many social interactions operate beneath an unspoken question. What do I gain from this connection? Once that question is answered, behavior adjusts accordingly. Understanding this dynamic does not require bitterness. It simply requires observation. And observation leads to an important realization. Many emotional wounds occur because people interpret strategic behavior as personal rejection. Someone ignores them, someone lies to them, someone manipulates them, and the immediate reaction is emotional pain. But pause for a moment and consider a different perspective. What if many of those actions were never truly about you? What if they were simply about someone pursuing their own interests? This shift in interpretation can be surprisingly liberating, because if something was never personal, then your emotional reaction becomes optional. This does not mean becoming cold or inhuman. It means understanding the rules of the environment you live in. Imagine a chess player sitting quietly across from an opponent. If the opponent captures a piece, the chess player does not feel personally insulted. They recognize the move as part of the game. They analyze it, they adapt, they respond strategically. But many people approach social life as if it were something different. They assume everyone is playing the same emotional game. They assume honesty will always be rewarded. They assume kindness will always be returned. Sometimes those assumptions are true, but not always. And when those expectations collapse, the emotional impact can be severe. That is why one of the most powerful psychological skills a person can develop is emotional distance. Not emotional numbness, not cruelty, but distance. The ability to observe human behavior without immediately absorbing it. Think of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. If the surgeon allowed every drop of blood to trigger panic, the procedure would become impossible. Precision requires calm. Observation requires stability. In many ways, navigating human relationships requires a similar discipline. Because the moment someone can predict exactly how you will react emotionally, they gain a subtle advantage. If they know criticism will make you defensive, they can provoke you. If they know silence will make you anxious, they can withdraw attention. If they know praise will make you compliant, they can flatter you. Each emotional trigger becomes a handle that someone else can pull. And once enough handles exist, your behavior becomes easy to guide. This is why some individuals appear strangely difficult to manipulate. They do not react the way others expect. An insult does not provoke anger. Praise does not produce immediate loyalty. Pressure does not create visible panic. Their responses remain calm, measured, sometimes even silent. To observers, this can feel unsettling, because unpredictability introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty shifts the balance of psychological control. There is a quiet scene that illustrates this perfectly. Two colleagues are sitting in a meeting room after a disagreement. One person raises their voice, criticizing the other's decision in front of the group. The accusation is sharp. The room becomes silent. Everyone expects a defensive reaction, but instead, the criticized person simply listens. No interruption, no visible anger, just calm attention. After the criticism ends, they respond slowly. Interesting perspective, I'll consider that. Nothing more. The conversation moves on. Later, several people approach them privately. "I don't know how you stayed so calm," one colleague says. But the calmness was not accidental. It was discipline. Because in that moment, reacting emotionally would have handed control to the person who initiated the attack. Restraint, on the other hand, preserved autonomy. This raises an important question. Why do emotional reactions feel so difficult to control? Part of the answer lies deep in human biology. Emotions evolved long before modern social systems. Anger prepared the body for conflict. Fear prepared it for danger. Sadness signaled loss. These responses were once essential for survival, but in complex social environments, those same mechanisms can be exploited. A competitor who provokes anger may cause you to make reckless decisions. A manipulator who triggers guilt may push you into compliance. A critic who sparks insecurity may weaken your confidence. In each case, emotion becomes an entry point. And yet very few people are ever taught how to guard that entrance. They are encouraged to express everything openly, to reveal every insecurity, to confess every doubt. This openness is often described as authenticity, but in competitive environments, it can also become vulnerability. Consider another simple moment from daily life. A person shares their frustrations with a colleague, revealing self-doubt about their abilities. The colleague listens sympathetically, they offer reassurance. But months later, during a promotion discussion, that same information quietly reappears. "He sometimes struggles with confidence," someone remarks. The earlier vulnerability becomes part of a new narrative. Not maliciously, perhaps, but strategically. This is why individuals who understand human behavior carefully protect their inner world. They do not reveal every thought. They do not react to every provocation. They choose what others are allowed to see. And that choice creates a powerful effect. Mystery. Humans are naturally uncomfortable with uncertainty. When someone's emotional landscape remains hidden, people begin projecting their own interpretations. Some assume strength, others assume calculation. Either way, the unknown generates caution. And caution changes how people behave around you. But developing this composure requires practice, because emotional discipline does not appear overnight. It grows slowly through observation, through small moments where the instinct to react is replaced by the decision to watch, through learning to pause before responding, through realizing that silence can sometimes communicate more powerfully than explanation. Yet there is an even deeper layer to this process, one that many people overlook. Emotional control is not only about how you respond to others, it is also about how you interpret their behavior, because the meaning you assign to an event determines the emotion you feel. If someone ignores your message and you interpret it as disrespect, frustration appears. If you interpret the same action as distraction or self-interest, the emotional response may disappear. The external event remains the same, only the interpretation changes. This simple psychological mechanism quietly shapes entire lives. And once someone begins examining it carefully, a new question emerges. How many emotional battles were never necessary in the first place? How many sleepless nights were spent analyzing someone else's behavior that had little to do with you? How many conflicts escalated simply because two people reacted instead of observing? These questions do not produce immediate answers, but they open a door that leads toward a different way of navigating the world, a way that values clarity over impulse, observation over reaction, strategy over emotional exposure. And yet, reaching that level of composure requires confronting something most people instinctively avoid. Because the deeper you study human behavior, the more another unsettling pattern begins to reveal itself. A pattern that explains why trust so often collapses, why admiration can suddenly turn into rivalry, and why the same people who once supported you can sometimes become the ones who attempt to undermine you. At first glance, these shifts appear random, but they are not. There is a structure beneath them, a hidden architecture guiding how power, perception, and emotion interact in human relationships. Most people sense pieces of this structure without fully understanding it. They feel the tension when someone becomes unexpectedly cold. They notice the subtle competition that emerges when success enters the room. They recognize the strange way admiration can transform into quiet resentment. But what they rarely see is the deeper mechanism connecting all of these moments. And once that mechanism becomes visible, many experiences from the past begin to rearrange themselves into a pattern that was always there, waiting to be recognized. But to see that pattern clearly, we must step even further back, because understanding emotional immunity is only the first step. The real revelation begins when we examine the invisible rules that quietly govern how people respond to strength, vulnerability, success, and independence. Rules that operate beneath politeness. Rules that shape alliances and betrayals alike. Rules that thinkers like Machiavelli studied with extraordinary attention. And the closer you look at those rules, the more one realization begins to emerge. A realization that changes how you interpret nearly every interaction you have ever experienced. But before that realization becomes clear, something else must be understood first. Because what truly makes a person untouchable is not simply the absence of emotional reaction. It is the ability to recognize the hidden incentives driving the behavior of everyone around them. And once those incentives become visible, an entirely different map of human nature begins to unfold. A map few people ever learn to read. And that is where the deeper understanding begins. But there is something even more unsettling hidden beneath everything that has been said so far. Because once you begin to observe people carefully, truly carefully, another pattern slowly starts to emerge. A pattern that explains why certain individuals move through life with quiet authority, while others, often just as intelligent, remain trapped in cycles of frustration, misunderstanding, and invisible conflict. It is not simply about intelligence, it is not about charisma, and it is rarely about talent alone. The difference lies in perception. More precisely, it lies in how others perceive you. Most people believe that respect is something earned through kindness, loyalty, or honesty. They assume that if they treat others well, that goodness will naturally be returned. But history, observation, and experience quietly reveal a more complicated truth. Respect is rarely granted because someone deserves it. Respect is granted because someone appears difficult to exploit. Think about a moment you have probably witnessed before. A new employee enters a workplace. They are polite, cooperative, eager to help everyone around them. At first, this behavior seems admirable, but over time, something strange begins to happen. People start assigning them more work. Colleagues interrupt them more often. Requests begin arriving late in the evening, not because anyone consciously decided to take advantage of them, but because human beings instinctively test boundaries. And when those boundaries appear flexible, they stretch. Now imagine a different employee entering the same environment. They are calm, they are polite, but they are also measured. They help when it makes sense. They decline when it does not. They do not explain themselves excessively. They do not apologize for every small decision. And something subtle happens around them. People become more careful. Requests become more respectful. Their time begins to carry weight. Why does this difference appear so quickly? Because humans constantly scan for signals. Signals of strength, signals of vulnerability, signals that reveal how someone will respond under pressure. And these signals are rarely communicated through words. They are communicated through behavior, through emotional reactions, through silence. Consider a small interaction that happens every day. Someone criticizes you publicly, perhaps during a meeting, perhaps in front of friends, perhaps in a casual conversation where a sarcastic remark suddenly shifts the tone. Most people react immediately. They defend themselves. They argue. They attempt to restore their image in the eyes of everyone watching. But there is another possible reaction, one that most people rarely consider. Stillness. The person listens. They do not rush to correct the accusation. They do not show anger. They simply absorb the moment with calm attention. And then, when the noise fades, they respond with a single measured sentence, or, sometimes, with nothing at all. Why does this reaction feel so powerful? Because it disrupts expectations. The person who initiated the attack was prepared for conflict. They expected emotion. They expected resistance. Instead, they encounter composure, and composure is unsettling because it suggests control. This is one of the quiet psychological rules that governs human perception. The person who controls their reaction appears to control the situation, even if nothing else has changed. This is why silence can be more intimidating than argument. Why calmness in chaos attracts attention. Why certain individuals walk into a room and immediately alter the emotional atmosphere without saying very much at all. It is not magic, it is behavioral signaling. But here is where the deeper insight begins to unfold. Because emotional control alone is not enough. Many people attempt to suppress their reactions while still carrying the same inner dependency on external validation. They remain silent on the outside while internally burning with the need to be understood, appreciated, or approved. And that internal tension eventually leaks through. Subtle expressions, small defensive remarks, the tone of a voice. The way someone explains themselves too much. People sense it, even if they cannot explain it. Which leads to a deeper question. What happens when someone truly stops needing approval? What happens when a person's sense of worth becomes independent from the opinions of the people around them? Something remarkable occurs. Their behavior becomes simpler. They stop performing. They stop chasing agreement. They stop adjusting themselves to fit every room they enter. And paradoxically, this is often when others begin to respect them more. Why? Because independence changes the entire dynamic of interaction. Most social relationships are built upon subtle exchanges of validation. I respect you if you respect me. I value you if you value me. I approve of you if you approve of me. But when someone no longer depends on that exchange, the usual rules stop applying. They become unpredictable. And unpredictability creates psychological gravity. Think of a person who enters a conversation without the need to impress anyone. They listen more than they speak. When they do speak, their words are deliberate. They do not rush to fill silence. They do not rush to defend themselves. They simply exist inside the conversation with quiet certainty. People notice this, even if they cannot explain why. Because most individuals are constantly projecting subtle signals of emotional need. Approval seeking, status seeking, recognition seeking. But the person who has stepped outside that pattern appears different, less reactive, less pressured, almost untouchable. This is the paradox many philosophers have hinted at throughout history. True influence rarely comes from trying to influence others. It emerges when someone becomes internally stable enough that influence happens naturally. This was one of the deeper insights observed by thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli. He understood that power is rarely about forcing outcomes. More often, it is about positioning oneself in a way that shapes how others behave. A ruler who panics loses authority. A ruler who remains composed during chaos strengthens it. But this principle applies far beyond politics. It applies to everyday human interaction. Because the moment someone realizes they cannot easily provoke you, control you, or predict you, something shifts. They begin to approach you differently, more cautiously, more respectfully.
Sometimes even with quiet curiosity. And yet, there is still one more layer beneath this entire discussion. A layer that explains why emotional independence can feel so difficult to achieve. Because human beings evolved to survive in groups. Belonging once meant safety. Rejection once meant danger. For thousands of years, being excluded from the tribe could mean starvation, exposure, or death. So the human mind developed powerful instincts designed to prevent that outcome. Fear of rejection, fear of embarrassment, fear of social isolation. These instincts still operate today, even though modern society rarely punishes rejection with physical danger, which means many people continue living as if every disagreement threatens their survival. They soften opinions, they hide ambitions, they tolerate disrespect, all to preserve social comfort. But once a person becomes aware of this ancient instinct, something extraordinary becomes possible. They can begin separating real danger from psychological discomfort. A disagreement is no longer a threat. An insult is no longer a wound. A rejection is no longer a collapse of identity. Instead, these events become information. Signals revealing the character, motives, or limitations of the people involved. And that shift changes everything. Because when interactions become information instead of emotional injury, clarity emerges. You start seeing patterns. You begin noticing which people respect boundaries, which people manipulate guilt, which people admire strength but resent independence, which people disappear when benefits disappear. The world becomes less confusing, less personal, more understandable. And with understanding comes calm. This calmness is not coldness, it is awareness. The awareness that most human behavior is guided by invisible incentives, ambition, fear, status, security. Once you see those forces clearly, the emotional storms that once dominated your thinking begin to lose their power. But there is a final realization that completes this transformation. And it may be the most important one of all. Because emotional independence is often misunderstood as isolation. People imagine that becoming untouchable means disconnecting from others, becoming distant, becoming cold. But that is not the true outcome. In reality, the person who is no longer desperate for approval often becomes more capable of genuine connection, because their relationships are no longer built on fear. They are built on choice. They choose who to trust, they choose who to invest in, they choose which voices matter. And because those choices are deliberate, they carry more weight. Imagine two friendships. One maintained out of fear of loneliness, the other maintained because both individuals genuinely respect each other's independence. Which one is stronger? Which one is more honest? Which one is more likely to survive conflict? The answer becomes obvious. True connection does not come from emotional dependency. It comes from emotional sovereignty. Two individuals who can stand alone, choosing to stand together. And when you reach that level of awareness, something quiet but profound happens. The world stops feeling like a battlefield filled with hidden threats. It begins to feel like a landscape of patterns. Some people will admire you. Some will compete with you. Some will misunderstand you. Some will attempt to manipulate you. But none of those reactions will define you, because the center of your identity will no longer exist outside of you. It will exist within your own clarity, your own discipline, your own understanding of human nature. And in that moment, the original fear that shaped so many human behaviors, the fear of being emotionally wounded by the world, begins to dissolve. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. You no longer walk through life trying to control every outcome. You simply observe, decide, and move forward, calm when others panic, silent when others shout, measured when others rush. And over time, something remarkable begins to happen. People start treating you differently, not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped needing it. And when that shift occurs, you realize something that few people ever fully understand. The greatest form of power is not the ability to dominate others. It is the ability to remain completely undisturbed by them. A mind that cannot be provoked becomes difficult to manipulate. A person who does not depend on approval becomes difficult to control. And a life built on internal stability becomes something that the chaos of the outside world can rarely shake. Which means the final lesson hidden inside all of this may be surprisingly simple. If you want to understand power, do not start by studying how to influence people. Start by studying how people influence you. Notice what provokes you. Notice what pressures you. Notice what makes you react without thinking. Because every one of those reactions reveals a place where control once existed. And once you see those places clearly, you can begin closing the doors, one by one. Until eventually, you reach a quiet realization. The world never truly had power over you. It only had access to the parts of you that you had not yet learned to protect. And once those parts become disciplined, observed, and understood, you do not become cold. You do not become distant. You become something far more powerful. Someone who walks through the noise of human behavior with calm clarity, untouched by the chaos, unmoved by the manipulation. And finally,
If you made it this far, you're part of the small percentage of people who truly want to change their lives. Leave a like, subscribe, and share this video so that, just like you, more people can develop a sovereign mindset. Don't miss the next video. It could be your first step toward becoming truly sovereign.